This is Issues and Debates on Paper 3. Paper 3 is worth 96 marks, it's 2 hours long, and the exam is on the 16th of June. Issues and Debates will be alongside forensic, eating behaviours and relationships. According to the advanced information, we need to look at free will and determinism, idiographic and nomothetic approaches, and ethical implications of research. Issues and Debates is worth 24 marks and it should take you 30 minutes. We'll start with free will and determinism. So for free will and determinism, you need to know the definitions of hard determinism, soft determinism, biological, environmental and psychic determinism, and the scientific emphasis on causal explanations. So if we start with free will is the idea that we all have the power to make choices about our behaviour. Hard determinism is the view that all behaviour can be predicted and that there is no free will. Soft determinism allows for some elements of free will. Biological determinism is the idea that our behaviour is determined by our genes. Environmental determinism, the idea that all behaviour is caused by previous experiences and is influenced by our environment. Psychic determinism, the idea that behaviour is determined by innate drives and early experiences. And scientific determinism, which is this idea of causal explanations and the belief that behaviour is caused by variables which can be controlled in experiments. In other words, the independent variable causes the dependent variable. So if we're thinking about some approaches that go alongside these, hard determinism, you could link that with the biological approach. I know you've got biological determinism there, but hard determinism does link to the biological approach also. Soft determinism, you could say that the cognitive approach has a little bit of soft determinism in there. Humanistic approach is really soft determinism. There's a lot of elements of free will in there. So yeah, I'd probably say humanistic for soft determinism and biological for hard determinism, like opposite ends of the scale. Then your biological determinism comes with your biological approach. Environmental determinism comes with behaviourism and the impact of the environment, or you could also use social learning theory there as well. Psychic determinism would be your psychodynamic approach, and scientific determinism, you've got your biological approach there and your behaviourism, which both have use like lab studies, and they focus on this idea of an independent variable causing a dependent variable. In evaluation, so strength, the concept of free will has practical value. So if we think we have free choice, then it can improve our mental health. So for example, if you believe that you have the power to change your own behaviour, then it will make things such as cognitive behavioural therapy much more effective, because you believe that you are the individual who is in control of your behaviour and you can make those changes. For example, Roberts et al. Looked at adolescents who had a strong belief in fatalism, so that the belief that their lives were decided by events outside of their control, and they found that these individuals were at more of a risk of developing depression than other individuals who believed that they had a choice and they could cause changes to happen in their lives. So it suggests that if we don't have free will, this could have a negative impact on our mental health. So even if free will doesn't exist, believing that it does has positive benefits to an individual's mental health, because you believe you can take control of a situation and you can change your behaviour, and it's a more positive outlook on life in general. Limitation, so we have brain scan evidence that does not support the concept of free will, and it does support the concept of determinism. So Lilbert instructed participants to choose a random moment to flick their wrist, but they actually found that when they were about to do this action, there was a split second before an area of their brain lit up. So it's this idea that when they consciously believed that they were choosing to flick their wrist, their brain had already predetermined when that was going to happen. So maybe our experiences of free will are actually determined by our brain before we're aware of them, and we just perceive that as free will. Finally, we've got another limitation, so hard determinism. This suggests that individual choice is not the cause of behaviour. So this idea that we do not have a choice and our behaviour is all predetermined is a hard determinism stance, and this isn't consistent with the legal system which we have. So in a court of law, offenders are held responsible for their own actions, and the defendant must have exercised free will in committing the crime. So in the real world, determinism and deterministic arguments, they don't work in our real life situations. We can always apply them, especially in a court of law, because we have to believe that an individual makes a choice to commit a crime. Next, we will move on to idiographic and nomothetic. So the advanced information, you need to know about the approaches, and if we have a little look, the idiographic approach involves the study of individuals and emphasises the uniqueness of individuals. It favours qualitative methods as individuals can be studied in depth. So for your idiographic approach, you're thinking more along the lines of the humanistic approach. This idea that we're focusing on an individual, we're focusing on the idea that every single person is different and we have to focus on them in depth. So we're looking at case studies as well as part of the idiographic approach. The nomothetic approach involves the study of a large number of people. It generalises the behaviour of these people to the wider population. It's an approach that uses quantitative methods which gather data from groups of people. So we use the nomothetic approach to create a generalised law which will apply to a large majority of individuals. We would use scientific routes of investigation often with a nomothetic approach. In evaluation, the idiographic approach contributes to the nomothetic approach. So although there could be limitations with the idiographic approach, for example, this idea that you can't establish causality, it's difficult to create generalised laws from the idiographic approach, it can be a good thing. We could use it as a starting point for an investigation. So if you use in-depth qualitative methods, then we've got a description of one individual which might support a nomothetic approach. It could give information on those generalised laws, it could challenge existing laws. So it could be a starting point, or it could be something that we use to check a theory, to falsify a theory. An example of this is the case of HM, which involved looking at an individual and comparing them to others, and it gave us an insight into what normal functioning is in terms of memory. So the idiographic approach still helps form scientific laws of behaviour, even though it doesn't necessarily use a scientific approach. However, it's still difficult to make meaningful generalisations from idiographic research because they use case studies and they're the least scientific methodology, and they often rely on subjective interpretation, and it's open to researcher bias. So a good example of that would be like Freud's use of case studies such as Little Hands. We have another strength, so both approaches fit with the aims of science. Nomothetic research is objective, it uses standardization and controls and statistical testing. But the idiographic approach also uses triangulation, where we use a number of different types of studies and we triangulate the evidence from that research to support a theory. And this increases the validity of idiographic research. So it suggests that nomothetic and idiographic approaches raise psychology's status as a science. So both types of research are good and they do support those aims of science. Then we have a final limitation. So the nomothetic approach loses understanding of the individual because it focuses on general laws, prediction and control. So if we're thinking about schizophrenia, the nomothetic approach would tell us that there's a 1% lifetime risk of developing it, but it doesn't tell us what it's like for someone who has that disorder, whereas an idiographic approach would help us understand the subjective experience of schizophrenia, and that could be useful when we're thinking about different treatment options for different individuals. So the nomothetic approach might not relate to real life experiences, and this is why we must use an idiographic approach alongside that to ensure an individual receives the correct treatment for their disorder. So finally, we have got ethics. So you need to be aware of the ethical implications of research studies and theory, including reference to social sensitivity. So if we have a little look here. So, ethical implications, the consequences that psychological research or studies may have. So you've got lots and lots of examples of ethical implications of research from things that you've studied previously. So for example, we've looked at Bowlby and monotropic theory, and there's ethical implications of that theory in terms of how it impacts working mothers and how it impacts fathers. Fathers may feel as though they're not able to care for their children as much as the mothers because the theory has been interpreted to see the mother as the main monotropic attachment figure. For mothers, it makes it difficult for those who want to return to work. There could be a stigma attached to working mothers because of monotropic theory. They may feel guilty, they may feel under pressure from society because of the findings of the research and the way that they've been interpreted by others. So if you have a look back through your notes that you've got, you can find lots of different areas where you have ethical implications which are part of the studies that you have previously looked at. So when you are revising for paper 3, you might want to take a look back at some of the other papers that you've already done and some of the revision that you've got, particularly paper 1. So it's not just Bowlby's monotropic theory, but it's other things such as psychopathology. There's areas in there, and like the idea that when you're diagnosing an individual with a mental disorder, often you don't take into account their culture, and this can have ethical implications because individuals from particular backgrounds, so like working class backgrounds and from different cultural backgrounds, are more likely to be diagnosed with mental illness due to the diagnostic criteria that are used, and this has ethical implications for those individuals. So it's worth looking back at the things that you've already studied to find some areas that you are very familiar with and that you feel confident in discussing the ethical implications of these pieces of research. We've got an example here. So, a study on depression may have consequences in terms of individual participants, the wider social group they represent, and for social policy. For example, an individual participant may reveal personal information that is later accessed by a prospective employer, or the findings of a study may suggest that people with depression never fully recover and therefore are a risk as an employee. In terms of social policy, the findings of a study on depression could inform preferred treatment options recommended by the NHS. So that's something from psychopathology, and that's an example from psychopathology that highlights this idea of ethical implications of psychological research. Some research is socially sensitive. So socially sensitive research, you have to be careful, you have to consider when you're planning the research and when you're conducting the studies, you have to think about social sensitivity. And Sieber and Stanley warn that the way you ask your research questions and the way you investigate your research questions could influence the way that the findings are interpreted. So being aware that your research is socially sensitive and taking care with the research from the very beginning is really important. For example, research into relationships has been guilty of a form of heterosexual bias, within which homosexual relationships were compared and judged against heterosexual norms. So when you do look at your relationships for paper 3, you could pick out a particular study which compares homosexual and heterosexual relationships, or a particular theory, so the theories of evolutionary sexual selection and preferences. All of that research in terms of like sexual selection is formed on the basis of heterosexual relationships, and that's a bias, and that can have impacts on the individuals. For example, it's not very fair to men, that research, and it paints them in a really negative light when compared to women. So you've got some gender bias there as well. Same sort of thing with eating behaviours. So a lot of the research on eating behaviours focuses on women, and it doesn't take into account men and their experiences of eating disorders. When we have this socially sensitive research, we have to make sure that we deal with participant issues such as informed consent, confidentiality, and psychological harm. And we have to focus on those and make sure that we consider these things. So, for example, in a study on domestic abuse, participants may worry that an ex-partner will find out about the study, and also it's likely to be extremely stressful for participants to describe their experiences. Such participants may provide informed consent at the start of a study, but may not fully understand the effect of the research. That can also apply to eating behaviours as well. So not just domestic abuse, but if we're thinking about eating behaviours in an individual who's maybe just been diagnosed with say anorexia nervosa, they might not fully understand the impacts that the research could have on them, especially if it's a really early diagnosis that the individual has had, or even if it's something that they're looking back on retrospectively. So it could even be attachment, and if an individual is looking back retrospectively on their relationships that they had as a child with their parents, then this is something that could cause unwanted feelings to occur, and they could be recounting painful memories. So this is something that an individual needs to be aware of when conducting the research, and safeguards need to be put in place. Researchers should consider in advance how research findings may be used. It may impact on what data they actually collect. This is especially important because findings from research may be seen as giving scientific credence to existing prejudices, such as studies examining the ethnic basis of intelligence. So there's one study that was conducted in the wartime in America, which looked at testing the IQ of potential soldiers, and it was a culturally biased piece of research, and it basically meant that white Americans who were upper middle class were more likely to be promoted to officers, and anyone else, especially anyone from a different cultural background or a different ethnic background, was deemed to have a low IQ and would not be given a higher ranking position. They would be put in one of the lowest positions in the armed forces. So that type of research and the findings, especially when the findings would be published to say like who has the highest IQ of army officers, that would support these existing prejudices and it would emphasise those. So it's really important to consider whether your research is socially sensitive. If it is, you need to think about that from the very beginning. You need to think about what research questions you're asking, and you need to also consider in the end, when the results are published, how is that going to impact these people, and is it going to support prejudices, or is it actually going to break these stereotypes that we have of certain individuals. In evaluation, we have a strength. So, socially sensitive research can have benefits for the group who have been studied. One example of this is homosexuality. In 1952, the DSM-1 listed this as a sociopathic personality disorder, but removed this in 1973, and this has been linked to the Kinsey report, which was based on anonymous interviews with over 5,000 men about their sexual behaviour. The report concluded that homosexuality is a typical expression of human sexual behaviour, and it also included the data on interviews with 6,000 women and caused outrage at the time because they were topics that no one discussed. So sometimes socially sensitive research can be good because it can break these stereotypes and it can change social policy. However, in some studies there could be negative consequences for the groups being studied. So for example, if we're looking at the genetic basis of criminality, there's a criminal gene, so the MAOA gene, and if this is true, then someone could be convicted on the basis that they have such a gene, or could they be excused because they could not be held accountable for wrongdoing. So there are wider moral implications, and there are implications for things like the justice system if we find certain types of research out, especially like deterministic research, which we've just discussed previously. However, again, we have a final strength here. So certain groups, such as policymakers, rely on research related to socially sensitive issues. The government looks at research when they're developing social policies, for example, decisions related to childcare, education, mental health provision, crime, etc. For example, in the UK, the Office for National Statistics analyse and disseminate objective statistics about the UK's economy, society and population, and this data is used in psychological research. So it's important for us to look at socially sensitive issues because this can change our society for the better, and it's important that we fund socially sensitive research, but we have an impartial body such as the ONS to carry out this research. And we have a final limitation. So poor research design may lead to findings which once in the public arena continue to have an impact. So A really famous example of that is the study which was conducted on the MMR vaccination and the development of autism in children. And that research was published, and it's had a huge impact, especially in the UK, on individuals who took up the vaccinations, and it has caused issues. Like when students went to university, there weren't many of them that had the MMR vaccinations, and then there were outbreaks of measles, which can have a physical impact on individuals, but then also it can have an impact on those who have autism and us finding the true cause of their autism. And once it's out there, the research is really difficult to take away from the public domain, especially if it's been published in a scientific journal. Okay, so that's all of issues and debates. I would say have a look at the exam questions, because a lot of these often come up with an item, and the item will often give you clues as to what to write about. I would also say for each one, so each type of free will, determinism, so hard, soft, biological, environmental, etc. Each approach, so idiographic, normal, nomothetic, and for socially sensitive research, I would make sure you've got at least one example from something that you have previously studied. So it could be something on paper 3, so something from relationships, eating behaviour, or forensic, or it could be something from paper 1. Like attachment is really good for a lot of these, the biological approach, and maybe psychopathology as well. So try and choose at least one example from something that you've previously studied to support these key terms and to support these theories and ideas and to support the evaluation points, etc. Because that will really help you in the exam, especially if you're aiming for the higher grades, because you'll be able to show better knowledge and understanding by providing these examples.